Back in 2021, I made a very difficult and not widely accepted decision. I felt that America was entering its worst ever economic, social, and political era. And I thought that a more preservation of capital versus capital appreciation would be appropriate, at least for me. And I share that with a financial planning group that I'm part of to our clientele and people that still follow me. I really feel as we here get through, into the late part of 2025, that'll come even more apparent.
Welcome to Discourse with Christian. I'm your host, Christian White, and today's guest is Peter Grandich. Peter is the president of Grandich & Co., a Wall Street veteran, market strategist, and author. It's an honor to have him on the show today. Peter, thanks so much for being on.
Oh, it's hard to turn anybody down with the first name Christian.
Well, obviously my last name as well isn't the most PC, if you will. Okay. Anyhow, that being said, would love to start off as I ask all my wonderful guests. What's your current take on the global economy and financial markets?
So, Christian, back in 2021, I made a very difficult and not widely accepted decision. I felt that America was entering its worst ever economic, social, and political era. And I thought that a more preservation of capital versus capital appreciation would be appropriate, at least for me. And I share that with a financial planning group that I'm part of to our clientele and people that still follow me. And I really feel as we here get through, into the late part of 2025, that'll come even more apparent, even though we had a brief, I believe, deserved, hopeful period on a change of administration in certain areas. Now, I have to tell you, I lose on both ends because I'm neither a Magna or a Trump hater. So whenever I speak about it, each side doesn't think I did enough to qualify to be like them. But I think for certain things that are most important to me that fall more on the moral social end, I think he was a lifesaver compared to the past administration and what was transpiring there. Economically, I differ. I feel that what has taken place here as his actions on the trade is actually going to end up being a net negative, as much as I hope I'm wrong on that. And then I think politically, this country is more divided now than any other time, possibly other than our Civil War. Not only is the middle class being destroyed, middle ground is also being destroyed. And I've experienced it now simply because of how I fall politically at this time. Almost no one is in the middle. They're either one way or the other. So the macro picture for the U.S. is not very bullish. I am quite bullish, and it's what helped me get very invested heavily into gold in a change in the world in terms of what's now, of course, playing out now. But this was back in 2021 on the belief that the world was moving away from the U.S., both politically, economically, and currency wise denominated, and that trading partnerships not involved in the U.S. or less involved in the U.S. would grow. And the most important one was the BRICS. I've been a huge believer for about 4 years now that they would continue to grow and become a force. And one of the things by what they were doing, and that was acquiring large quantities of gold, that the gold market would perform very well to the point where I chose to own physical gold versus stocks and bonds. And I don't think 1/10 of 1% of financial people were doing that 4 years ago. Still probably to this day aren't. So I have a better worldly look economically for certain areas, but I still think the social and political aspects of the world involving the U.S. And I mean, I don't want to run on here on Christian on you, but I I had a lot of involvement in Canada. For 25 years, it was my home away from home. I did a lot of business there. I went up to do a lot of their financial shows. I still have a lot of Canadian friends. And I thought the worst that would ever be between the United States and Canada was a great movie that was out several years ago called Canadian Bacon. It was a comedy and it made fun of both sides, but it also demonstrated how close we were and how similar we were. And that's gone. That is clearly not the case anymore. So if we're not doing the best, really, have been our best allies for as long as, for at least 100 or so years, then I think that also is happening around the world and is going to get worse and not better.
Could you share perhaps your thoughts over in Asia or Europe? Any thoughts that you care to share as it relates to that?
Yeah, so I have to be careful there because from an economic standpoint, I'm impressed by China as the way they run a country and how they treat the people and how they act. I'm not, but I try to be a realist in my finances. I do come from a Christian based foundation. My Catholic Christian faith is the most important thing to me, but I try to look at it objectively. And for instance, when we began this year, I suggested that U.S. stocks were grossly overvalued compared to the rest of the world. And one place that commanded interest is Asia, primarily China, and also countries like Singapore, which I think if I had to choose one other place to live, just from a business standpoint, Singapore is a wonderful country. It's a country for the future and all. So I'm a fan economically, but I do have great reservations spiritually and socially on how China is run.
And as it relates to kind of the big picture, macroly, one of the questions that I have for you is, you've mentioned about America kind of heading towards a banana republic that's been mentioned, previously. If trends don't change, what urgent steps could still realistically help us avoid that fate?
Christian, to answer that totally honestly, which I try to do in every interview with every question, is I think we're down to God's intervention. I really do. That's my personal belief. I try to temper that understanding that there are people out there that are not going to have those same beliefs. But just a couple of months ago, we had a ray of hope. We had an apparent person, at least was trying, I think so anyway, Musk, to do something about deficits. At least get the deficits under control, not even start to talk about the 35 or $36 trillion in debt that we've already occurred. And that has already dissipated and basically gone the wayside. And as Rand Paul has talked in Senate in the last couple of days, the current bill that's before the Congress looks like it's going to add another $5 trillion in long term debt. That's the total amount that just was unimaginable just a couple of months ago. We were thinking that there'd be no deficit, and we may even, Trump was talking about how the debt was going to be paid off, whether it was through Bitcoin or something else. And all that's gone by the wayside in less than 100 days. And we're right back to the problem that not only the United States has, but 7 or 8 out of 10 families that I see in our planning. We're spending more than we make. And until we turn that around, starting with our own families, it's not going to get any better. The problem is we're getting to the point now, Christian, that even the Congressional Budget Office, which may be the last bastion of some sort of bipartisanship in Washington, because the rest is totally gone. These folks can't even go in the same room together anymore. It is pointed that we're going to get to 54 trillion at this rate, and now only about 8 years from now. And that's going to be we're going to have real issues about servicing the interest payments, let alone no ever thought of ever paying off that debt or paying down that debt. So I think, unfortunately, the little ray of hope that existed a month or two is gone. And that while I have a list of 10 or more factors that I'm concerned about, the number one is the debt. Now, I have to also tell you, full disclosure, I get that because in the book that I've depended on for finance, the Holy Bible, it doesn't have a positive verse. It has nothing but warnings and issues to demonstrate what too much debt can lead to. And I think we're living that out now, just not as a country, but as corporate America, and of course, families in America. Whereas, one thing that came out of this new administration, I happen to like the Secretary Treasurer. I think he has a fairly good head on his shoulder, and I would hope that Trump listened more to him going forward than some of the other people he surrounded himself with. But he made a very good point. I think every financial advisor should not only be aware of this, but so should their clients. He noted statistically that the 10% wealthiest people in the United States own 86% of all the assets. The next 40% own 14%, the remaining 14%, and half America doesn't own any. And we just seen statistics in the last few weeks of how 1 out of 4 people now are using credit cards just to pay for food and gas. And that not even 35% of Americans have $2,000 from emergency. All the things that, if you get past that top 10% who live in a different world than we do, they're in a, I had a touch on it, Christian, because I dealt with very wealthy athletes at one time. And truly, when you're flying on private jets and you have people driving you and shopping for you and everything, you don't have a real idea what everyday Americans are facing. And one of the clues that I give to people is we need to watch what the top 10% are doing, because that's what's going to affect and impact everybody else. So debt in general is one of several concerns of mine, but it's the single biggest one.
And I wanted to piggyback on what you mentioned about I've mentioned on previous shows I've provided housing and such, and it's always it's been alarming to me because I've had more people who are I'm early 30s. I've had people who are twice my age and such, and where they really don't have anything, like literally, and it's very spooky to me. To your point, how I guess stratified it is and such.
Let me answer, if you don't mind, to that, because you brought up a very good point. Two-thirds of Americans are working paycheck to paycheck. My other one of the other 10 biggest things is a retirement and aging crisis. Uh, that those beautiful commercials we may see tonight when we turn on the commercial by the financial service firms and how you live this last part of your life in somewhat luxury and all, it's not going to work for a lot of people. And unfortunately, it's going to cause a lot of issues for those of us that may even been blessed to not be in that position, because you just can't. Trust me when I tell you, somebody that just turned 69 years old never thought, hey, I'd be this old. And then I never realized how things change when you get this old. It's going to be a lot more difficult for this aging population to do the things, to continue working and do the others. And they're going to call upon government and, to assist and et cetera. But the other thing that's about that is what really changed in the planning business. I never saw people that were coming in that were either retired or close to retiring coming in with mortgage debt. Now, many of the people that are already into the 60s and 70s are still carrying mortgage debt, and also debt that they're helping children with, and so forth and so on. And so the ability to retire has become far harder. People talk about how housing has become so unaffordable. The affordability index is at the worst level it's ever been. Well, the retirement, if there was such an index of how good can it be to retire for most people, is probably at the worst level it's been since I've been in this business for 41 years. And these are all things that kind of get lost in the day-to-day financial world, because much of Wall Street focuses on those 10% of those people that are up at those levels. But the rest of the majority of people in America have much bigger challenges ahead, and they're not getting addressed, or at least getting an understanding of how difficult they may actually be.
Absolutely. And as it relates to that, I've had some people on the show where they've mentioned how, I guess, similar to '08, where, uh, people came in to, help bail out companies and such and things of that nature, and obviously there's been a lot of talk of when the economy is going to, fall apart or this or that. What are your thoughts when some people say that, the government or other entities are going to be able to just keep propping it up so it keeps on going for, many years to come? I mean, could you shed any light on that or your thoughts?
Sure, it's far more difficult now to do what they did in 2008. But I'm glad you brought that up, because I like to take people back to that, because they forget we have short term memories as humans, and that is when we had that crisis, when the mortgage thing, when we had financial service firms actually selling products to their clients, taking the other side that would have benefited if they don't work out. And then, because of all that, created this mortgage crisis. The government then bailed them out, but not the poor people that took those mortgages and all. No one went to jail and all the other stuff that went on. And you can talk about that. But what I bring that point up for is that's when quantitative easing was created. And people forget when Ben Bernanke got together with Obama, when they announced the great bailout and the banks were going to be bailed out. The reason we were going to bail out the banks was not to save their hides for, again, doing things they shouldn't be doing, but money was going to go into the infrastructure that at that point was already viewed in America as deteriorating and troublesome. And it would get into Main Street, and that would help rebuild the economy and turn things around. It never made it. It stayed in Wall Street. Very little trickled into Main Street. And then we had, I don't know how many more QEs after that. And now we're, I don't know, debt is almost tripled from what the level was then. And infrastructure is, again, one of my 10 biggest issues. And we're seeing it now. Unfortunately, I know you're out in LA, that the horrific fires that never needed to get to that point if things would have been done the way they used to be done 30 or 40 years. And it's all around the country and the world and everything. But so to answer your question is, it'll be much more difficult. And this is so important to understand. I don't think a Democrat and a Republican can get in the same room with each other anymore. In fact, I think there's certain members of each party that can't even get in the same room with other members of their own party. There's even a split now happening in the Republican caucus in Washington and all. Some of the real conservatives, that think we should be focusing on the deficit and all, and some, that they call rhinos that are Republicans in name only and all. And then the Democrats, there's no more anyone that's willing to say they're a conservative Democrat. It's gone very, very left. And so I don't think the political and economic ability to bail out a financial crisis like we saw in 2008 is viable anymore.
Yeah, it seems like the kind of the bifurcation there politically, on different sides of the aisle has just been exacerbated, and it seems like it's more so than it was, I guess, even in the '60s, even with kind of the turbulence going on socially.
Yeah, and I, grew up as a kid in that, but when things got really bad, people united. We have not seen that. I don't expect them to be grabbed. In the worst of cases, it's so divisional now, and part of that also is, and people don't want to talk about this issue. This is clearly an issue that I get a lot of pushback on, and all, is that the America more survived and prospered for a couple hundred years because there was a moral fabrication that was built, call it Judeo-Christian, whatever you want to call it, but there was a moral basis that was practiced, and it was practiced basically, didn't really matter what your fate was or where you lived or what you did for a living. That's basically been deteriorated or gone, and this relativism has swept. And of course, there's also certain groups that have been going on for I don't know, 1,200 years or whatever. The Islamic view is so radically different than, I didn't use radical on purpose; it came out that way, but it's so different, and it's seeping now into even America. It's clearly in Europe. You just have to look at France and even Ireland, and now Canada, and it's happening here in states like Texas, where no one ever imagined, of all states, that that'd be transparent. So there's so many of these things happening that aren't understood by the average person investing out there and trying, to get through. And that's why when you add them all up, and we haven't gotten into some of the others, it's very hard for me to have a very bullish outlook. Other than this counter trend rally that I suspected would happen, but I think once, however, the trade thing peaks, and it'll peak with, I think they'll use this India thing as, and India looks like the one country that's going to fairly soon come with an understanding with the United States. And then I think Trump will realize he needs to back off and start giving more companies and industries not having to face it and all. I think he's recognized that he thought they would come running, and then no one really came running. And he's going to have to move on from that, because we're going to face some very serious shortages of things. And if the market somehow doesn't stay up and that turns down as well, then he's going to just lose any momentum he may still have from his election.
And could you speak more about the counter trend rally that you referenced?
Yeah, so the market got way overdone on the trade news. I mean, I saw things I never thought. I'm in my 42nd Christian, and I never thought I'd see this day. And it was the day we came in after the overnight, when basically the credit market almost imploded worldwide. And I never thought I'd see a day when the stock market would fall. I don't know, it was a couple thousand points. Percentage wise is important, because when it was 2,000, a couple thousand would have been a lot more than when it's 40,000. But to see it down hard, bonds down hard, and the dollar down hard, and of course gold went up $100 that day. But the dollar or bonds always would be run to if the stock market had a really bad day or there were fears of it. And that didn't happen. And that was another signal to me of the change that's afoot and what's kept me, remaining bullish for gold, even though I believe a correction had to occur. But the counter trend rally in the stock market got overdone. And quite frankly, this goes to one of my other 10, so I might as well discuss it now. Uh, Almost 50%, it's 46%, I think is the number, of licensed financial advisors in America right now weren't even born when I started practicing in this business. And why I bring that out, that doesn't mean because I have more experience, I'm that much smarter or that much certain to be correct. But I do believe that they've been in an era where basically it's been a one-way street. Yeah, we had a couple major hiccups or suddenly a traffic accident, and then this Federal Reserve came along with this tow truck called the put, cleared it right away, and everybody was able to go, straight forward. And it's much easier to drive straight forward. You just put the gas to the pedal to the metal and you go. My fear was that it didn't need that the stock market had to go down a lot or these predictions of crashes, but if we just stopped going up a lot, not only would financial advisors be at a loss on how you handle something like that, but people who are living beyond their means, who've gotten accustomed to above average returns, are going to have a lifestyle wake up call. But one of the things that I knew was they've gotten so used to it that it's going to be a series of declines, and then hey, you always buy the dip. I mean if I think I'll say this to you, Christian. I believe a lot of financial advisors, not all of them, but a lot of them could be tossed off the top of the Empire State Building and all the way down, they'll all say the same thing. Hey, so far, so good. And that's how they view things because you just buy the dip. That's what they've been trained on. That's how it goes. And they're going to do that until it finally doesn't work. So it's going to take multiple rallies, declines, and eventually, once people start to see after several months or a year or two that, hey, this stock market isn't the certain thing that I always thought it would be, that's going to be where we have the problem. But there's something even more important, Christian, and maybe people haven't spoken to you about this, and I think we need to. When I entered the brokerage business in 1984, 87% of the trading was by retail investors. In fact, there were only two stock exchanges then, the New York Stock Exchange and the American Stock Exchange. Now the New York Stock Exchange might as well be a museum. It may look nice seeing it on that financial network, but that might as well be a museum because most of the trading is not happening there. And I'll get to another point about that in a minute. But now over half the money that's in the stock market is in what's called passive funds or passive investments. These are funds that are being not actively managed, meaning the manager is just responsible, he or she, to track some sort of indice or index. The biggest, most popular one is an S&P 500 index fund. And so the manager's responsibilities as money comes in is to try to match the performance of the S&P 500. So they buy the stocks that make up the S&P 500. And it just so happens that the Mag 7 or a few of them make up the largest single percentage. And as long as money was coming in, it kind of like was a self-fulfilling prophecy. Well, if we have a reversal and those people now decide that they want to come out of that, that manager also doesn't have the discretion to go, no, I'm not going to, that's a very good stock. I'm not going to sell it. No, they're not going to have any choice. We saw a little bit that in this trade panic. We saw some of those funds, and that's why the technology, what we call the Magnificent Seven, got more punished because they were overweighted in those types of funds. But the other half of the money, and it's not 50-50, but it's somewhere there, that remaining half, 2/3 of it is being handled by some sort of computer algorithm trading. Now, maybe programs that are just trade based on words when there's a headline, or some very sophisticated programs where they're simultaneously selling stocks or futures or options or what have you. Only a small percentage now of the volume in the markets are individuals like it was 40 years ago wanting to buy and sell part ownerships of businesses. So I always tell people my age, hey, those of us with gray hair or no hair, you can't look at the market like you did 30 or 40 years ago. It's a totally different species. And one other part about that, besides that and the potentially lack of real experience on the financial advisory side, Bloomberg made a very interesting study and came out a report and said that for the first time, more volume was trading on what they call black holes, or exchanges where the volume isn't reported like we see each and every time. This is where major institutions just trade with each other. And so people tell me they're technically trading, and I say, but you're technically trading based on not all the volume that's happening in those stocks. So the big picture on that is to understand that this is a much different stock market than our moms or dads, or if you're my age, when we were younger and all. And you can't use some of the same ways that you've approached it in the past. And I'm just afraid that it's gotten out of hand. And one other thing that happened, which kind of irked me as well, since you seem to want me to express all what's on my mind, there was too much strange trading in that time frame. When in recent weeks we would see suddenly stocks of certain groups be sold heavily, and then a couple hours later an announcement came out from the White House or something, and then the reverse happened. And now we just saw that the sons of the president announced, at least they announced it. The previous administration's son didn't even announce what he was doing. He just did it. But they've announced these clubs and all, where for 500,000 or $1 million you get access. And I'm afraid between that and all the trading that we've now seen, Congress, I mean, Christian, if we should be upset about anything as Americans, we should be really upset that people are going into Congress making between 100 to 250,000, whatever the number may be, and coming out with millions, if not tens of millions of dollars from stock investing. How are they managing to do that when most professionals can only average 9.9, whatever the average return has been now for stocks? And these are the people rules, and they still haven't changed the rules to make it illegal even to have inside information. Now there's a bill that Holly's brought out calling it, Pelosi is the symbol in it, whatever it stands for. But how can we expect anything to be done on all the other issues that we talked about when we have folks here who are profiting off the backs of Americans? So again, it's just one of many, many issues that I have that greatly concern me, and why I take this live chicken versus a dead duck attitude towards general investing right now.
As it relates to that, and perhaps some of the things that you've experienced over on Wall Street and such, could you share perhaps other things that perhaps the average person that walking down the street is not aware of, or things that are not really talked about very much that you care to share?
Well, I just think that we need to be candid of that. Money is not bad in itself. One of the most misquoted scriptures is, money is the root of all evil. That's what some people know it to be, when it really says the love of money is the root of all evil. So money itself is not bad. It's what we do with it. It's just like a gun isn't bad on its own. A gun could be used for very good, useful purpose. Well, it was invented because we had to hunt at a period of time, and that's how we fed ourselves. But if a bad person gets it, it can do a lot of damage. I don't think we do enough in the world, in my financial service industry, to understand about a topic that almost everyone as an investor eventually has and wishes they didn't. And that's mental anguish. And that's what led me to be in this business. I didn't even finish high school. I was a warehouse manager. I took a small little amount of money, traded options, only to meet a penny stockbroker and lose it all back within less than 6 months. And the mental anguish from that loss stuck with me for years, especially when I got into business and realized how they did it to me, far more than the financial. I think people need to understand what can happen when plans don't go right. For instance, traditional financial planning, the way it's practiced now, and of course it's practiced very sophisticated now with computers and graphs and charts and bells. When I started, it was a pad and a pen. But the bottom line is, you know that there's risk if you just would read the disclaimer, where the disclaimer says past performance is no assurance of future results. Yet that's what people are banking on, that hopefully something in the past continues to go forward. And I think we need to present to people plan B's and C's. hey, this could also do this. And the reason it isn't is once a lot of people realize that, they back off taking the aggressive plan A's. And that isn't how Wall Street exists. I learned that back in 1987 when, not even in the business 3 years, they made me head of investment strategy. I forecasted a crash. They said you can't do that because most people will not benefit from it, so retracted or resigned. The crash came, and then the next day I said, okay, in 2 years we'll be back to a new high, and that elevated and created what we the moniker of the Wall Street whiz kid. But I really believe the Archangel Gabriel could show up at a market strategist's home tonight, tell him God himself is telling him or her that the market's going to crash, and that person could head to their headquarters tomorrow and they wouldn't be able to say it. So, what I would say is it's not as independent and unbiased as you may think or be led to believe by the marketing material and all. And I really just think people need to do a little bit more homework, or at least treat their financial advice the same way they were their doctor or legal advice. And let me kind of finish on that topic with this. 80% of money managers underperform the S&P 500 index. So 8 out of 10 times you would have been better off simply putting your money in an index fund than giving it to an active money manager to manage it. And 85% when it comes to bonds. I wonder if we were talking and looking for a doctor and a lawyer, and I told you 8 times out of 10 there's been a better lawyer or a better doctor than that one you're going to, would you still go to that doctor? And I just think those are some of the things that if we make people recognize and realize those things and understand that sometimes the simplest thing is best. Spend less than you make. Understand that there are certain things that are more important. Christian, I can go off of this and I'll just use this last one because it's one of my favorites. They're a wonderful business. They've done nothing wrong, but they're a poster child for what's wrong with America, and that's public storage. You can't go a mile or two in any major or half major town and not see a public storage facility. Now, what's really unique about that, when my parents and grandparents were alive, we lived in much smaller dwellings, and there were no public storage facilities. If there was, there might have been one or two of them in all. So, with all this extra stuff this generation and the current generation has acquired, to have to pay people to keep it elsewhere, even though we have much larger dwellings to begin with, every medical study says we're more of a mess as a society now than any other previous society. So, the other thing that a lot of people don't want to hear, but it's part of my business, is we have too much stuff. I could get a bigger home, Christian. I could get a bigger car. But the financial and other aspect strains of it is just not worth doing. But a lot of people don't want to hear that because society has taught them that somehow more stuff will equal more happiness. Wall Street and Madison Avenue have knowingly or unknowingly conspired to basically plant this in your mind. There's no way the bus driver can be happier than the guy that owns the bus company, when in fact more people with little or no means are average much more happier than some of the richest people in the world. At least that's my experience.
Yeah, I agree with you on that from what I've heard from others as well. And I wanted to comment. Being a millennial and my parents being boomers, it is interesting to see their approach to lifestyle and such. Despite maybe how I'm presented or perception and such, was definitely raised in a very frugal environment, if you will, and having been to different areas and whether it's living in a place like Newport Beach or going to other places and being in the family office environment, things of that nature, it's interesting to just kind of juxtapose different worlds from those who have memory or who were raised by people who had memory from the 1930s versus people born in more recent times and their proclivity to want to acquire, to your point, and such.
Yeah, well, I just think that one of the other things that I thought when we were raised, some of the things that a parent would have done or my parents would have done would cause the police to show up at our doors now, and yet I think we came out pretty okay net from it and all. So, but that's where society has gone. I'll again go back to you. I think the more we moved away from that moral base that multiple religions accepted and worked from, the more issues that we've had. And some people say, is it too late? I says, well, it's never too late if God decides it's not too late. But I do think on average, people are over that. And I'm afraid that the relativism or or agnostic or even atheist viewpoints, one of the things that I think, if you, people say, Pete, what would you change if you could? I think minority opinions are minority opinions for a reason. I don't think 96% of people should have to change dramatically the way they look at something because 4% of people think something else. I think you need to respect it and you need to be accommodating where you can, but I don't think the vast majority of people should have to change or in some way suffer because a very small minority of people think different than them. That was one of the best things about this country that didn't exist even 100, 200 years ago in other places. And that itself has caused a lot of the issues and problems we have now. And even in my own business, the amount of what little people can say because of concerns of what the legal repercussions could be from it, let alone the social aspects and all. So it's a very, it's a very it's much more challenging, I think, in my industry now than in any other time. But if you listen to how they speak, you would think it's just buy low and sell high, which is always, what comes out of what you hear from a lot of what we call the talking heads or the people you may see a lot in the media on a regular basis.
And regarding just society, the division going on and things of that nature, it almost seems as if you need some type, and you mentioned about kind of the moral component to society. It almost seems like you have to have some common enemy or something happen to where there's like a great awakening, if you will, or something where people are more unified again, whether that was, unfortunately like 9/11, like I feel like brought everyone together, or, other, perhaps the Second World War, things of that nature.
Yeah, well, it did, and for a while, churches got crowded and so forth and so on. But we've slipped from that, and part of that is that well, go back to the fact that 2/3 of Americans, and I really don't think the 10% is, or even the next 40% understand the bottom 50% what they're going through. You know, 2/3 of Americans are working paycheck to paycheck. If they don't get up to work, whether they don't feel good, whatever, the kids might not eat. We may not be able to live in our rental apartment, whatever. But where it's really hurting, and my wife and I got very involved locally, and that's when we realized how bad it really was. The amount of people who are now online just to get food, just here in the US, it's happening elsewhere, Canada especially, is grown by such proportions. The local food pantry where we're involved has seen 1,000% increase in 5 years in the number of people. And almost half the people online now are working class people, both members working. But that's how difficult it's come because of cost and all. And those people they're not representative. They're not getting the representation that certainly the top 10% are. But eventually, if it becomes so overbearing for them, especially those that do want to work and all, they are only going to have choices to somehow fight back. And that's my concern here now. This is maybe I'll wrap up on this if you don't mind. And that is, when Trump won, I stated publicly that I thought there'd be an era of enthusiasm because there were people, and I was one of them, that felt that the past 4 years were the worst 4 years that this country has had to endure politically and being run on a national level. But I thought it would only be short lived. And the problem now is that there is such hatred, just that violence will become, that anybody had thought that that group was all right, Trump won, we're giving up the fight, we're going to go back and live our lives. I said not only were they going to get worse, but they were going to resort to what mankind has always resorted to, and that's violence. And we're seeing it now. We're seeing governors and some others literally telling the people, basically, you got to be violent in the street. So I think, unfortunately, after this recovery runs its bases and the recessionary type of things that are taking place now that are going to make 6 or 12 months from now more tougher economically and all, is going to allow those people to become more violent. And I'm afraid once that happens, the ungodliness of violence, uh, hopefully people of Judaism and Christianity, even Hindus that I know and all, they're not they're not a belief that their God calls them for violence, but there is a certain faith that is growing worldwide that believes God wants you to kill other people that don't believe in what you do. And I think that's the next big social issue that America will face, because we're already seeing it in other parts of the Western world. If you've not been to England or France or even Ireland, which I was married in and go to often, and seen the changes in the last 10 years or so, or even the last few years, uh, they're now hitting the shores of North America, both in Canada and the US. And I think unchecked or unrecognized is only going to fester and become worse as time goes on. And that'll just be another of series of negatives. And that's why I have this get it chicken in a foxhole, or what I like to say, Christian, is be a live chicken versus a dead duck. If I'm wrong and Nirvana returns, what happens? So, okay, I'll be happy. But if I'm right and I'm not prepared for it, it could become very, very difficult to live a daily life as Americans.
Well, Peter, I know we only had so much time, and I appreciate you coming on. How can people learn more about you and get in touch?
I'd be shocked after hearing this if they want to know more. To say, Christian, because that's what it's been basically like for me for these last few years. But that's okay. There's the next page. There's a petergrandich.com where there's a blog, and there's also a YouTube where interviews like this I put up, as well as from time to time interview others.
Peter, thanks so much for being on, and looking forward to having you on down the road.
Oh, that'd be great again, Christian. Thank you for having me. God bless you.
God bless you as well.